One night in 1996, Brian Bethel was sitting in his car about to deposit a cheque when two boys appeared at his window. Instead of exiting his vehicle, Brian stayed in his car because something about the kids unnerved him deeply. It was only when one of the kids moved closer he saw what was wrong. It was a night Brian would never forget and the birth of a mysterious new phenomenon. This time, it's black-eyed children. Let's get weird.
The history of mankind is riddled with the weird and the wonderful. Bizarre people, strange places, and odd events. For centuries, we've told each other fantastic stories around campfires and in darkened rooms. Tales of ghosts, UFOs, and conspiracies. But are these stories exactly that? Stories? There's only one way to find out. Dive into the rabbit hole and enter Marc W. Shako's Weird World.
Hello and welcome to Marc W. Shako's Weird World, and this time we're looking at a relatively new phenomenon of black-eyed kids or BEKs. We'll go over the origin story, some further experiences from other sources, and then we'll take a look at what I think is the most convincing and terrifying encounter. Of course, before we get started, how convinced are you that black-eyed kids are even a thing? We don't deal in black and white here at Weird World, so put a percentage on it between 1 and 99%. Have you got one? We'll come back to that later. Good. Right. Now all that's out of the way, let's get weird. The place is Abilene, Texas, and the time is 1996. Brian Bethel, an internet blogger and journalist, sits in his car writing the cheque he's about to drop into the night slot of his internet service provider. Yes, kids, that's how we rolled in the mid-90s. When he's surprised by a sharp rap at his window. He's writing a cheque by the light of a nearby cinema, so, preparing himself for the worst, he looks up and is relieved to see two boys, aged around 11 years old. He winds his window down, readying himself for a sob story requiring him to hand over pocket change, when he was overcome with an incomprehensible fear. The kids seemed normal enough, but something about them was off. The boy who knocked on the window is olive-skinned, while his fair-skinned redhead friend loiters in the background. The olive-skinned boy, rather than asking for change, asks to be taken to his house. They want to see the Mortal Kombat movie, but as well as shitty taste in films, the boys are apparently forgetful because they've left their money at home. The requests to be let into the car intensify. It all seemed plausible enough at the time, though the longer the conversation went on, the more Bethel was gripped by a seemingly irrational fear. Looking for any excuse not to let these kids into his car, he glanced up at the cinema and realised that the last showing of the film had already started. There was no time to drive the boys back home and then return to the cinema. While Bethel was calculating distances and times, the olive-skinned boy was continuously trying to convince him to let them into his car. It won't take long. We're just kids. It's not like we have a gun. That's when Bethel looked back at the kid, and that mushrooming dread became all too rational. Both boys stared at him with eyes of soulless, empty, inky blackness. No irises, no pupils, no whites, just entirely black eyes. The ground seemed to fall away beneath him, and fear clutched at his stomach. It was around this point he made every excuse he could think of to beat a hasty retreat, all the while apologising profusely at the Satan spawn staring back at him. With a staggering ability to make things worse, the olive-skinned kid started banging on the window screaming, "Let us in! We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay." As he screeched from the parking lot, Brian Bethel threw a glance in his rear-view mirror. The boys had gone. There was no time for them to run anywhere, and so began the tale of the black-eyed kids. Since Bethel's story in the 1990s, there's been an explosion of internet stories. So what exactly is going on here? Theories abound, from demons to vampires to kids playing around with spooky-looking contact lenses. Okay. So, while skeptics are rolling their eyes at demons and vampires, when was the last time you were tempted to put contact lenses in for a prank? I don't know, but before we get into the online stories I promised you, let's have a quick look at some common themes that accompany these sightings. So, black-eyed kids generally look like normal, regular, everyday children, with the obvious exception of those completely black eyes. Anyone who sees black-eyed kids reports a feeling of deep dread, like some kind of fight or flight instincts involved. Feelings range from anxiety to terror. They are commonly described as wearing dated clothing or dressing in a manner that is not typical of a normal child of their age, which kind of feels like something trying to replicate an approximation of a human. Black-eyed children commonly ask for something. Examples are like Brian's story, asking for a ride in your vehicle or to enter your home. But they can't come in unless they're invited, which is probably where the vampire thing comes from. There are no reported stories of what happens when you let a black-eyed kid into your vehicle or home. All the stories come from people whose eerie feelings have basically protected them. Instinct. Trust your gut, folks. And the story has been added to internet creepypasta lore, but to this day Bethel insists, and since I wrote my original blog post on this back in the day, markwshako.com, I've heard him interviewed on Jim Harold's Campfire podcast. Check that out, it's great. His story has not changed, not one word. Got to say, I was skeptical myself when I heard the story, but the man sounds like he believes what he's saying, at least. So, without further ado, I found some compiled stories online. This is from Thought Catalogue by Chrissy Stockton, link obviously in the show notes. So let's read and rate the stories. I deliberately didn't read these before recording, so you're getting live reactions. The stories might be shite. First story, titled by Chrissy, Midnight Caller. It almost felt like a dream. I woke up to my dog Lucy barking. She was upright on the bed where my husband and I were sleeping with our 22-month-old daughter, staring at our door like an unknown stranger was out there rummaging around. I thought she was just freaking out over a house noise. We'd only had her for 3 months and she was still a puppy. It could have been anything. Our roommate, a creak from the house settling, the awnings moving outside in the breeze. I wasn't too concerned initially. I decided the best bet would be to open the door and show her nothing was there. It sounds a bit silly, but that's what we do with our daughter when she gets scared, and I figured it would work with a puppy too. I opened the door and she raced to the front door. She stood there snarling at the door. It was an angry, violent growl one had never heard her make before. I looked groggily at her and opened the baby gate blocking the doorway, planning to open the door and show her everything was okay. The second my hand reached for the deadbolt, Lucy went wild. She started barking and jumped toward me, and when I touched the metal, she suddenly changed her temper. She whimpered almost like she was afraid and backing down. As her mannerism changed, so did mine. I wasn't calm anymore. My heart was racing and sinking at the same time. I had been flooded with a mixture of fear and dread. I looked through the peephole. I can't explain why I looked, but I did. Outside were 2 kids. One was just a smidgen shorter than me, and didn't look much younger. I'm 21 and she looked to be 16 or 17. She was slender and pale. Her hair was a light shade of honey blonde and she wore it long, about mid-back, with long, thin, blunt bangs in the front that covered most of her eyes. She wore jeans, a light wash that's popular right now, and a thin-looking, olive-coloured pullover-style hoodie. She held the hand of a small girl who looked to be around 3 or 4, in the same style jeans, and a button-down ivory cardigan. The smaller one looked at the floor shyly, but but had the same shade of hair tied back in a ponytail. She held a stuffed toy under her free arm, and it was identical to one my daughter has, as was their style of dress. Had it not been for the feeling of overwhelming dread and fear, I probably would have asked these children in and given them some tea or hot chocolate to get them out of the bitter cold, but something about them seemed off. At this point I hadn't made any noise. I hadn't shushed the dog or grumbled, nothing. I hadn't turned the lights on. These kids had no indicators I was at the door. The older one spoke. She had a voice that was mature, confident, strong, and accentless. She had her head tilted downward and I couldn't see her eyes. She said, "We have to use your phone," and I stood frozen in fear. How did she know I was there? She raised her head to face me directly, and that was when I saw her eyes. There was a reason I couldn't see them through her bangs before. They were black, or midnight blue, or a dark, dark purple. They were otherworldly. She said, "Our mother is worried." As someone who has always been interested in creepy stories, I knew what she was the second she looked at me through the door. I've never been one to believe in these things. As a staunch atheist and skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, I had written off many a ghost story from friends and family members eager to tell their tale. I didn't believe it. Still, I couldn't rationalize my way out of this. I was standing with nothing but a thin wooden door between me and a black-eyed kid. There was no questioning what was right in front of me. I did not answer her. Slowly and silently, I backed away from the door, Lucy still cowering at my ankles. She kept talking. "Just let us in to use your phone." I took another step back, and with that the tone changed. At first she seemed polite. When I took that second step back, she became commanding, almost hostile. "We're not going to hurt you. If we wanted to do that, we would have broken in. I'll ask again, may we come in and use your phone?" Lucy snarled at the door, and I inched backward, though something inside me seemed to be slowly pulling me back toward the door. It wasn't a physical pulling so much as a subconscious need to go back and let them in. I got to my room, covered up the window, locked the door and sat there in the dim light of the night light. I heard her call me back to the door once more, and then quiet. I didn't go back to sleep that night, and I haven't slept right since. I know from reading about them that BEKs can't just come in without permission. I know they haven't hurt anyone, but I still fear I'll be the exception. When I told my husband, he said it was just a dream. He keeps telling me to forget it, but this lingering feeling of sadness, this dread when the house is silent at night, this fear of a knock at the door, this tells me otherwise. So that was story number 1. A few of the tropes in there, the late night, let us in, all of those sorts of things. Pretty creepy if you think about being in that situation yourself, but let's move on. Story number 2 is entitled Bus Encounter.
I was riding the bus back home after work. It was about 1 a.m. and I'm a security guard and often work odd hours. So I'm sitting there and this guy gets on, sits across from me. He was wearing a suit, had a briefcase, regular looking guy in his 20s. What struck me about him at first was that he was chewing a cigar, not smoking it. You can't smoke on the bus. So I was just looking at him while he stared out the window and chewed his cigar, and all of a sudden, he turned and looked at me. His eyes were pitch black, just as you described. My heart started beating like a mad motherfucker, and I felt my gorge rising. I was starting to panic, and I had no idea why. I was just pants shittingly terrified of this guy. Then he grinned at me, and his teeth were all covered in tobacco bits and brown juice, the cigar clamped between them. I almost screamed, but instead I had the presence of mind to just get up and take the seat right behind the driver. I calmed down a bit after that, but I kept an eye on the guy. He ended up chatting with some girl that got on, and they were still talking when I got off. I later convinced myself he was just trolling me, having fun with a pair of contacts. Now I wonder.
That was story 2, Not sure about that one. Somebody looking a bit older is interesting, but I don't know. I don't think I'd move and then sit so this weirdo is behind me where I can't see him properly. Something just doesn't quite feel right about that one. Maybe it was a dude in contact lenses. Who knows? Let's move on. The next story is titled Halloween.
This is so funny. I'd never heard of BEKs before my incident, so I came on here to post my story, and the first story I see is about a black-eyed kid. Weird. Let me preface this by saying I'm by no means a writer, just a domestic engineer living in North Texas. Also, I don't believe in the paranormal, ghosts, demons, aliens, whatever. However, I did have an event happen to me this Halloween, I have to admit, has me scratching my head. This is my first post on Reddit, and sorry to say I'd never even heard about it until yesterday. I told my best friend about my incident, and she's an avid reader of No Sleep and told me if I didn't post it she would. So, here I am. Anyway, hope you like. So, it had been a slow trick-or-treat night in our neighbourhood that evening, which is pretty odd in itself. We usually have kids from different areas dropped off in hours and have a constant parade at our door. That night, I'd say we had no more than 8 or 10 groups of kids come by the entire night. It was about 9:30 p.m. and my husband and I were sitting in our family room watching some of those ghost shows based on supposedly actual events. Like I said, I don't believe in that stuff, but we do like a good ghost story now and then, and it was Halloween after all. We hadn't had any activity at the door in over half an hour, and it was getting late, so we decided to turn the porch light off and let our dog Chloe out of her crate. Chloe is an American bulldog and is very docile. We only put her in her crate because we were afraid she'd try and get out to play with all the kids, and I didn't want to have to chase her down the street. Also, we didn't want her to scare any of the kids because she would look a little intimidating to the younger ones. So I turned the outside light off and let Chloe out, and she followed me back to the couch and lay down at my feet. It was getting close to 10 p.m. when my husband decided he'd had enough fun for the night and was going to go upstairs, take a shower and get ready for bed. After all, it was Thursday and he still had to get up early the next day. My teenage son was out with his friends at a local haunted house and wasn't expected back for another hour or so that left me alone on the couch with Chloe. Now, just because I don't believe doesn't mean those shows don't freak me out a bit, and being alone now, watching, I'd have to say I was kind of on edge, as it were. It wasn't long after I heard the upstairs water for the shower turn on, when there came a light knock, knock, knock at the front door. My initial reaction was, what the hell, really? It's almost 10 o'clock, go home. But soon an uneasy feeling came over me. Why the knock? Our doorbell glows in the dark. Without the porch light on, it would be extra obvious to anyone out there. I paused. I couldn't really just ignore it. Our front door has a big beveled glass panel, and anyone right at the door could see in enough to see someone was in the family room watching TV. It would be pretty rude for me just to sit there and not answer it. Knock, 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 again from the door. I glanced down at Chloe and she was gone. My gaze followed her usual path to the front door, expecting her to be on her way there as she normally does. Nothing. She wasn't there. I stood up to look around the room better and found her crouching by the back door like she was wanting out. However, she never has to go out like that. She always comes and licks my hand or puts her head on my knee. This was totally out of character for her, and I have to say heightened my anxiety. "Chloe, crate," I said. She just turned back to look at me like, "Hell no, lady, ain't moving." I yelled up to my husband, but he was already in the shower, and I knew there was no chance of him hearing me. Knock, knock, knock. About that time a car drove down our street and cast just enough light on the door to where I could see the silhouettes of 2 small children through the glass. I instantly felt relief. It was just some kids, probably a couple of my neighbours on their way back home that wanted to stop by and show me their costume or something. I headed to the door and looked back to make sure Chloe wasn't going to follow. What a great watchdog, I thought to myself, as she just sat there. I turned on the porch light when I got to the door, and sure enough, I could see through the glass that it was a couple of pretty small kids. A little late for such young ones, I thought, and I began to wonder about what kind of parents would let their kids run the streets that late at night. I only opened the door enough to where I could block Chloe's escape, which was only about 2 feet. What struck me immediately as odd was the kids weren't wearing any costumes, they were just in normal street clothes. Also, no customary trick or treat either. I began to feel very uneasy again. It was a girl and a boy. The girl to my left was older, I'd say about 11 or 12. I could tell she was blonde, but I couldn't make out any distinct features as our lights are from high above and on columns at the front of the porch, so most of the light was coming from behind them. I hadn't opened the door wide enough for any light from inside to hit them directly. The boy was younger and about a foot shorter, I'd say 8 or 9, and looked to have light brown hair. The girl very politely spoke up. "Ma'am, can we please come inside and use your phone to call our mom?" As she spoke, something in the pit of my stomach was telling me something was wrong. What kid, even at that age, doesn't have a cell phone of their own these days? I couldn't remember the last time somebody had asked to use my home phone. Hon, don't you have a phone of your own you can call your mom on?" I asked. This is when things really got weird. Both kids turned to look at one another like they were going to say something to one another, but neither of them spoke. They both turned back to me and the girl said, "Mum, my cell phone battery doesn't have any charge left in it. Can we please come inside and call our mother? We're alone out here and my brother is scared." I have to admit there were 2 competing feelings going on inside me. The first, that of a mother's heart that wanted to help out these 2 small children get home to their mom. The other, a sinking feeling in my gut that was keeping the other feeling at bay. It was then that I noticed during the short conversation that I'd already opened the door an extra few inches, which I was completely unaware of doing. I stopped. "Honey, why don't you give me your mother's number and I can call her myself?" Another pause, and again they looked at one another. After a short moment they turned back to me and the girl said, "Mom, my little brother has to use your bathroom. Can we please come inside while you call our mom?" And with that last statement the little girl moved closer towards the door, like she was just going to walk in by me. As she did, she stepped into the light coming from the inside of the house, and I got my first real good look at her. Solid, jet black eyes, that's all I could see. That motherly instinct was gone and replaced by terror I don't think I've felt in my life. I could feel every hair on my arms and the back of my neck standing at attention. I closed the door to just where my face was able to stick out. The little girl stopped and again pleaded, "Please, Mom, we're really scared and we're alone out here. We have to come inside, please help us." Then, like on cue, both kids began to whimper and cry. That's when the fear took over and I shut and locked the door. "I'll call your mom if you give me the number," I shouted through the door, "but I'm not letting you in my house." I could still see them stand there on the porch, just staring at me through the beveled glass pane. Part of me wanted to run upstairs to my husband, but the bigger part didn't want me to lose track of where they were. That would have freaked me out even more, not knowing where they were. After what seemed like forever but was probably only a few seconds, I decided to call my neighbour that lives across the street. As I made my way to the side table by our couch to my phone, I glanced at the back door. Chloe was nowhere to be found. We later found her in the guest bedroom under the bed. When I got to my phone and started to look for his contact info, it was only then that the kids stepped away from the door and began to walk to the street. As they did, I walked to the door to get a better look to see where they went, still not calling my neighbour. If you get close enough to the glass, you can see out enough to make out people's shapes, but you can't see much detail. Of course, standing that close to the door would make you pretty obvious to anyone outside looking in. From the door, I could see that the kids were still standing under the street lamp nearest to my house, staring at me. As I lifted my phone to my ear after calling, only then did the kids start walking down our street. I met my neighbour out under the lamp once he was out there, but the kids were nowhere to be seen. Like I said, I don't believe in any of this stuff, and I never even heard about black-eyed kids before talking to my friend. What I really think, or what I have to think, is that these kids were just out yanking people's chains on Halloween night. But I will say this for them, they were good. Really good. And they scared the shit out of me and my dog.
Well, I've got to say that story's a lot better than story number 2. And a good point for me to pivot away from the article. There are more of those stories there. If you want to find them again, that will be linked in the show notes. The reason I've saved this next story for last is because I've heard it from the source. Stories online are fine, but you never know if you're reading creepypasta or something off Reddit No Sleep, which of course there is a strong possibility those stories are just pure fiction. The next one I heard from the source. So just before we get to that, a quick word from our sponsors, which is me.
For more spooky strangeness, visit www.markwshako.com. And now, back to the episode.
This story comes from around 2009, and I believe it's from a relatively new state trooper. He was out one night watching for speeders, and he said that you have to be going a good 15 miles per hour over the limit to land on his radar. Finally, he gets one. He follows for a short time and flips the lights on. The car pulls straight over. He says that protocol dictates when you pull over a speeder, you call it in. Make, model, colour, location. So if something goes sideways, dispatch knows where to send help. For reasons unknown to the man himself, he did not do this. It was the first time, and it would also be the last. Maybe he was distracted by the feeling he got, because he said the moment he pulled over, the hair on his neck and arms stood on end. Fight or flight had kicked in, before he's even set foot out of the car. He steadies his nerves and approaches the vehicle, stopping level between the front and back doors. From the angle he's at, he can't see the man's face, just his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Pouring from the window is an ungodly smell, like something from a farmyard. The back of the car is piled with bags, so maybe they're the source of the smell, but whatever is going on, something feels badly wrong. He asks for the usual license and registration. There's a slight angling of the head to acknowledge he's been heard, but that aside, nothing. He repeats the request. The response is the same. He says something along the lines of, "I can see you were in a hurry there. Just give me your paperwork and we can get you on your way." To this point, because he's standing slightly behind the driver for safety protocol, he still hasn't seen his face. That is about to change. The slight angling of his head becomes a slightly wider turn. The man still hasn't uttered a word, but now his mouth moves. Not to talk, to smile. A widening Cheshire cat smile. Too wide. The shivers hit him anew, and then he sees the man's eyes. Pure black eyeballs of soullessness. The state trooper is shocked and takes a couple of instinctive steps back until he's standing in the middle of the first lane of the highway. He raced back to his car and then back to the police station, doing well over 100 miles an hour, and just sat in the car park for a while to compose himself. After a short time, a colleague came out to ask why he was sitting there with his lights flashing. He didn't even realise he'd left them on. The state trooper called this into Jim Harold. There's a realism to his telling where you can feel he's just recalling and reliving the horror. He sounds completely convincing and like he fully believes what he saw. So, to make your mind up time. I do think the most unsettling quality of these stories is just the simplicity. Stories online tend to have embellishments and a flair for the dramatic. Tales from the one like the State Trooper seem actually quite understated. Is it vampires, demons, human-alien hybrids? With that one source story from Brian Bethel and then many springing up afterwards, this bears all the hallmarks of an urban legend. I may be wrong, of course, and that story from the State Trooper does give me an adult dose of the heebie-jeebies. And how many things affect you enough to say heebie-jeebies? The way he told that sounded all too believable. Before I heard that, my percentage was pretty close to 0, and it went right the way up. Now, granted, I did hear that story on a podcast, again, the wonderful Jim Harold's Campfire, for you true ghost story fans. But I say that only to say that I have no idea about the guy's credibility, but my God, if he was faking, give him all of the awards. To Brian Bethel's credit, he sounds believable too. And in all the years he's been telling his story, it too has that understated quality. All stories and myths and legends have to start somewhere, and I'll be honest, as I sit here at the tail end of 2024, I remain not totally unconvinced. Did your percentage go up after hearing these stories? Let me know in the comments. I suppose it boils down to this. If 2 kids showed up on a rainy night, asking to be let in out of the cold, would you let them in? I don't think I would. That's all for this time, thanks for listening. Keep it weird. The intro music is Slasher by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio, check out his YouTube channel. The outro music is Lone Wolf by Guillaume Bernard. Please remember to like, subscribe, rate, review and share this episode wherever you may have heard it. And you can find me on Facebook and X as Marc W. Shako. For more information on my books and all things podcasty, visit www.markwshako.com. Thanks for listening.